mine. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the show, is today marks a very, very deeply uncomfortable question for South Africa's democracy and stability. And the question that's very, very important to ask is who actually holds the monopoly on force in this country. There was a new analysis from Defense Web which argues that the South African state is increasingly struggling to assert exclusive control over the use of force within its borders, a foundational principle, I think we can all agree, for any functioning state. And the concern is not theoretical by any means. It points to rising organized crime networks, entrenched gang-controlled territories, cross-border criminal economies, and just repeated failures again and again in rapid state responses during major security incidences. July 2021 comes to mind. And at the center of this conversation and debate is whether South Africa's state security architecture, from policing to intelligence to defense even, are those entities still capable of enforcing authority and enforcing it uniformly across the country? And to help us unpack some of these claims and just the broader implications for sovereignty, for governance, and investor confidence, I think, because it all boils down to that at the end. We are joined by Chris Hattingh, Executive Director at the Center for Risk Analysis. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to News and Views. Really appreciate you giving us your time.
Salelo, good morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about these very important matters as we are now on the 30th of June.
Pleasure is all ours. And I want to jump right into it, Chris. When analysts say South Africa is quote unquote losing its monopoly on force, what exactly does that mean in practical terms on the ground, in communities, in our borders, in just general day-to-day living in the country?
Sure. So not to get too philosophical, but for centuries, if not for decades, if not centuries, the accepted definition of a state, of a government, is that it is an entity within a geographical territory that maintains a monopoly on force. So it uses that force to enforce rights. It protects property. It ensures that its citizens are safe from all kinds of threats, foreign and domestic. And it does employ that force then to maintain law and order. If we look at South Africa, if you look at it on a very basic level, when the state no longer has a monopoly on force, and it's not necessarily a black and white issue. I think it happens sort of on a gradient over time, that a state does lose its monopoly on force. For communities on the ground, for businesses, one looks at phenomena such as a very high crime rate. You look at things like homes and businesses and communities that have to rely on private security, where they can't rely on the police or on the army or on the Air Force, for example, where for emergency services, they also have to rely on the private sector or community initiatives. And that over time, it leads to competing sort of poles for force or for power. It doesn't mean it can't exist in a good way going forward. It doesn't mean it can't work well together. Today, as an example, we're seeing how the South African government and the South African Police Service is relying on and has brought in South Africa's private security companies to help prepare for potential shutdowns today. That already tells you that the state, in South Africa's case, is already relying massively on the private sector. And while it hasn't completely lost its monopoly on force, it is, over time, that is being eroded. Maybe just a very last point in terms of context. If one looks at the number of private security officers versus the number of police officers, the number of police officers in South Africa is around 150,000. The number of private security officers is around 600,000. So more than the police and the army. And that tells you something about the sort of lay of the land in terms of force capability in South Africa.
And I think that takes me to my next question, because there's always rather a difference between what is evidence-based versus perception. And this assessment that you're making now, how much of it is based on measurable institutional decline that we can point to, or are we dealing with perception driven by high profile crime and instability that we sometimes see in the country? I think crime especially being the most notable one.
Absolutely. If one looks at the homicide rate in South Africa, it unfortunately continues to be one of the highest in the world, and it affects the South African citizens, Black South African citizens, the most on a daily basis. Their ability to do business, to move around, to go to work, to look after their families and their communities, all that kind of thing. I think it's a good point that you make around perception and sort of reality. It might be a bit of a chicken and egg situation. So
Yeah.
if the perception is that the state doesn't have the monopoly on force, criminal elements, other elements look for opportunities to take advantage. That then leads people to relying on private security, which in turn then means they rely less on the police and the army, and that in turn further lessens their dependence on the state, and the state again recedes further and further into the background. We'll see today, in terms of the planned marches and the planned shutdowns, if those happen and the state is able to control them well and to maintain law and order if things do escalate. It will tell us that there is still some capability and some element of intelligence and security planning that is possible on the part of the state. But
Mm.
if it's not tested, it might be a bit of a sort of a placebo effect to say things are still okay. It's interesting though today that the South African state is showing that it can mobilize these resources, the limited resources that it does have available. We're seeing reports this morning of mobilization of the police and the army, as well as the private security services in many parts of the country. So it shows you the resources are still there. Whether the capabilities, the management, the intelligence sharing, the planning is still there, that's a different question.
Mm, you mentioned quite something that was quite very very important, referencing private security and how over the years we saw its growth. Are there any other specific regions or sectors where it looks like the state is already no longer the dominant enforcer of law and order and they have to outsource it to other entities?
I guess some of the biggest examples would be things like education and healthcare. I know that's of course not security related and sort of force related, but in those sectors, those South Africans who can afford private security, private education for their children, they rely on those private services as much as possible instead of state services. If one looks at things, for example, the last few years, something like Operation Vulindlela, the reform program by President Ramaphosa, so much of that has relied on skill sharing and resource and sort of pure money sharing in terms of capacity building by the private sector, where the state has tried to recapacitate ESCOM, has tried to recapacitate some elements of SAPS, of course, Transnet and the logistics reform. There are elements of where over the last 10 to 15 years, the private sector has been called on by the government to come and try and help. Maybe the next example that we will see is water infrastructure and water provision.
Mm,
It's obviously very difficult to replace bulk government water infrastructure with private infrastructure, but I mean, if one looks at the state of water supply in the country, it might be at that point where the private sector is forced to try and help and to assist. And again, if it's done in a sort of good, long-term, sustainable way, it could help. Of course, the risk is that you have sort of private interests capturing what should be state government capacities and responsibilities and using those only to benefit those people who can then pay for those services. So it's a difficult balancing act, I suppose.
I want to wrap up this question with maybe just your quick analysis of how the state has prepared for the 30th, which is today, around 600 million. I think it was, the amount that we were given that, resources are going to be invested into today. And I think the following days that come afterwards, you mentioned private security and how the state looks to also integrate them. Your analysis, maybe even looking back to July 2021, where it almost felt like law enforcement and intelligence was caught with their pants down. It was a surprise. They were very, very reactive in how they went about things. This time around, your analysis, are you feeling a more prepared law enforcement integrated system that is in place? What do you make of it?
I am feeling that they are more prepared this time, and it's the difficulty I'm having at the moment in the analysis is it a case of actual sort of capacity that has been built over time, or is it a case of this deadline was given beforehand
Ah,
and then the state
good
had time
point.
to prepare? So there
Point,
is
yeah.
that bit of a question. Let's see if it happens, if this happens again, how the state reacts or not. Let's see also, I find it interesting that these organizations that have set the deadline, that have voiced many of them legitimate concerns, they've shown that the state that they are able to get the state to react to them. And this sets a precedent going forward where civil society, other kinds of organizations where they feel maybe things like voting, the normal process doesn't get the state's attention. Maybe they feel this kind of thing is necessary. You threaten and you say you're going to do mass national shutdowns, and that gets the government to react. That potentially sets a precedent long term for South Africa, where it's a fragile government. It's a government that has some capacities here and there, but it is forced to react to sort of the civil society, to private interests the whole time.
There we go. Chris Hattingh, Executive Director at the Center for Risk Analysis. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
There we go. Going to take a quick break. We'll be back with you right after this.